Welcome to today's program, The Future of U.S. National Security. Today's discussion will address a number of important topics and challenges related to the United States Army and the future of national security. And who better to speak on this topic than people who serve our country? We're joined by three members of the Army War College's Eisenhower Series College program, along with Melissa Flagg, our visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse, our moderator for today. I'll now turn the program over to Colonel Leon Perkowski, the director of the Eisenhower program, who will let you know more about the program and formally introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction and for inviting us to be with you here today, even though today is a sad day for Ukraine, Europe, and the world. And I just want to acknowledge that before we get started. And before we get into our panel discussion, I just wanted to provide you a little bit about what the Army War College is, to tell you a little bit about what the Eisenhower program does, and then I'll introduce our panelists today and our moderator. The Army War College is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it provides a land power-centric graduate education to senior military and civilian leaders. When our prospective students reach the rank of lieutenant colonel or the equivalent, they compete for a selective opportunity to attend a war college, where they will receive a 10-month education that will help prepare them for the next level of responsibility as a senior leader within our armed forces or our national security establishment. And one of the goals of the War College is to help prepare these expert military practitioners to advise policymakers who might lack extensive military knowledge or experience. And to be effective advisors, our students are trying to become more effective communicators with civilians, like many of the people in our audience today. And they do that by better explaining their own military perspectives, but also better understanding your perspectives as well. And that's where this Eisenhower program comes in. The Eisenhower Series College program started more than 50 years ago during the Vietnam War. And its fundamental mission continues today: to improve mutual understanding of national security issues by engaging in candid dialogue with colleges and community groups around the country. Now, this is an elective for our students, and we ask our students to broaden their knowledge by researching the topics they present to you. Thus, they should not be considered true subject matter experts on the topic, but rather they provide an informed military practitioner's perspective on that subject. And that perspective is rooted in their experience of connecting the strategic to the tactical or implementation level of operations. And we value the dialogue we're going to have with our audiences today and in the future. So thank you for being with us here today, and we look forward to your questions later in the panel. It is now my pleasure to introduce this excellent panel of speakers for you today. First, we have Lieutenant Colonel Mike Burns. He's a native of Charleston, South Carolina, and he has served more than 27 years in the U.S. Army. He has spent the last 12 years as a public affairs professional, serving at multiple echelons across the globe and with multiple deployments to Iraq and Kuwait. Next is Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Lynn. He is an Army officer with a 19-year career balanced between tactical leadership and academic endeavor. He has deployed to combat 6 times with infantry and ranger units, and most recently commanded an artillery battalion of 700 personnel in the 101st Airborne Division. And finally, we have Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Walsh, who is a U.S. Army Reserve judge advocate and a former federal prosecutor. As a judge advocate, Lieutenant Colonel Walsh has served as a legal advisor to a military police unit in Iraq, as an associate professor of national security and criminal law, and as a military prosecutor and defense attorney. And finally, our moderator today will be Melissa Flagg, a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse. And she is the founder of Flagg Consulting LLC, as well as a senior advisor to the Atlantic Council Geotech Center and a fellow at the Acquisition Innovation Research Center at Stevens Institute of Technology. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research. And finally, before we go into our panel discussion, I want you to be sure that what you hear today are our own opinions, and they do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Department of Defense, the Army, or the Air Force. And with that, Mike and Melissa, why don't you start us off?
It's all you, Lieutenant Colonel Burns.
All right, great.
I really appreciate being here. This is really exciting for us. It's my first one online, but like Leon said, I've been in the military since I was a junior in high school. So this is, outside of some strategic like dishwashing or serving, this has really kind of been my thing. And I've been able to do all the cool stuff that you see on the recruiting posters, from working on helicopters to commanding tanks in Iraq, and my favorite, jumping out of airplanes. But I'm excited to be here to talk about some of the research that I've been doing at the War College. And when you think about why the military exists, why we're here, it's really to defend the nation. And it's the leaders who sit at the top, at the highest ranks in the military, it's really on their shoulders to kind of do that. So it makes sense for the nation. It's in the best interest of the nation that the best qualified and most talented individuals are selected for those positions. And really, regardless of their race or their ethnic background. Demographics right now show that we really are doing a good job at recruiting initially a very diverse organization. But when you look at our senior ranks, our colonels and our generals, the minority representation really drops off pretty dramatically. And there's lots of factors that cause this, multiple things. But regardless, it's it really affects our ability to defend the nation and defend our national interests, and of course, to fight and win our nation's wars. A lot of the research in the past has kind of looked at this problem, at least for when I was doing my research, 10, 15 years back, they've been looking at this problem. And a lot of it focuses on what I consider the point of entry for military officers when they join, the accessions point. And a lot of the research either attributes it to increasing the number of African Americans who join the military, or providing training them to be better when they come in, or it correlates the problem of underrepresentation at the senior ranks to a lack of diversity within the combat arms, where most of our those are the career fields where most of our generals actually come from. But if the Army is not really a true meritocracy, regardless of the increases that you make to the input, you're still going to get the same output, and I can talk about that a little bit later. So that's really what I tried to do in my research. I wanted to look at it as take a kind of a systems approach, look at it as a framework, a more holistic approach, and see where we could make changes to the system to get a different output. I think we've dabbled with the input for many years, and we've seen some improvement. I don't want to make it look like there's been no improvement. There has been a lot of improvement. I definitely have more opportunities than my father did when he was in the military. And my son right now he's going to join in a few years, and I'm positive that he's going to have more opportunities than I did. But again, just looking at the system to see how we can make it better.
That's great. Lieutenant Colonel Lynn.
All right, thank you, Melissa. And yeah, really sorry we couldn't be there. We had plans on debating Pats and Genos tonight, so we'll have to save that for another time. A little bit about my background, military career, 20 years, had the opportunity to attend UPenn's Wharton School of Business a couple of years back, and then teach economics. I'm also a father of 5, so if you hear me talking about technology and human capital development, it's from both a military and as somebody with a personal vested interest. The Army's used land navigation as a tool for screening leaders and leadership potential for about 50 years. We use it in some of our most important and most competitive selection processes, from selecting ROTC candidates to Ranger School, even into special operations, special forces type qualifications. Something about the ability, the spatial relational ability to take a 2-dimensional map, turn that into a 3-dimensional ability to navigate from one point in the earth to the other. Obviously a necessary skill, but really we see it correlated with other, very important leadership capabilities and capacities. And one of the things we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is a severe degradation in entrance ability to navigate. And I personally attribute it, and am researching, the cause and effect of technology, really smartphones, and what I call the center of the universe button on phones, and the impact that technology has had on our human capital development. Because it's concerning how quickly our recruits, both officer enlisted, are getting worse at this, what we see as a very essential skill. Look, technology, your smartphone, Google Maps is clearly an improvement in technology. I went to Florida. I took my kids to Disney the last weekend over President's Day weekend. We could drop in, get a rental car, put the GPS up, no prior knowledge, and navigate right to the hotel and back, drop the car off. It's an improvement in technology at a snapshot in time. What we're seeing, though, is when we look at human capital development, the technology by which our society produces it, military age personnel, there seems to be an atrophy, and it seems to me that it's from the lack of the need to struggle, the growth opportunities that having that technology applied earlier in life is providing. And look, the smartphone and the mapping is the microcosm, but there's other places that early application of technology is changing the way and the environments in which our human capital is being developed. And the DoD needs to look at this. We need to look at is there ways we can take the raw material we have at the front end and make up for that lack of experience that some of our younger recruits have. As we're acquiring new equipment, we need to account for not just the current degradations, but project out future possible areas where our human capital is likely to atrophy in some of these areas. And then the equipment we have, how robust is the network? How reliable are those systems? Because we talk high-end military exquisite technology. Look, we're not anti-technology. We need those things. But one of the phrases we have in the military is, do we maintain the ability to fight with the lights out? If our adversaries were to see that as a point of advantage for the U.S. military, do we have the ability to bring it way back to the Stone Age and do some of those old school things? So we want to make sure we're keeping an eye as the technology gets applied earlier to our human capital development, that we're keeping an eye on that.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Lynn. I think we've had two really good examples of thinking about how the military needs to be tackling some new and some old challenges as we think about the future. And we're going to finish up initial remarks with Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, I think with another version of that. Lieutenant Colonel.
Thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Pat Walsh. I am an Army lawyer. I'm a reservist. In my civilian life, I've spent a lot of time as a prosecutor dealing with national security and terrorism issues. In the military, my experience has been between military justice issues and international law cyber related issues. And I'd be happy to talk about those if you want. But today I want to talk about extremism. This came to really a head on January 6, 2021, as we all watched the events at the Capitol. And for me, it was very, very personal. I knew people in the Capitol, as many of us did, but I also spent time in my civilian capacity training the Capitol Police, specifically on how to use force. And so watching them became very real. All of that was bad enough, but what shocked me very early on was seeing individuals in the crowd and recognizing clearly that they had military experience or law enforcement experience, both the clothes they were wearing, the patches that they had, but how they interacted with each other showed. And we've learned since that there were veterans, primarily, some who were active in the military, but about 10% that have been prosecuted are veterans of the military. And that's a very shocking thing to someone, because everybody who joins takes an oath to defend the Constitution, and there was an attack on one of the very functions of the Constitution. And so dealing with how to identify extremism in the military and what to do about it is a great challenge. We could pause and say, maybe the military shouldn't be responsible for the actions of those that have left the military. That's a veteran, by name, is by definition is people who have left. But the truth is, it does matter to us. It is personal to us. And so we need to tackle that. And given my civilian and military experience, while you punish extremist activities, and it's right and just to do so. That holding people accountable in criminal courts, punishing people, kicking them out of the military, unfortunately doesn't reduce extremism. In fact, sometimes it can reinforce extremism. And so the military is working on finding ways to identify those that might be extremists in our group, either before they join or since they are in, and deal with them, hopefully discourage them from extremist activities or dissuade their extremist views before it leads into criminal actions that they should be punished. So be happy to talk about that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you're all willing to come and tackle, I think, uncomfortable problems, right? I feel like often there's a perception in the civilian world that we don't actually allow, I think, a voice from many of our active duty military. And I think this is a great opportunity and example to highlight the level and rigor of the type of educational experience that we do give our military officers. And also the fact that we want you to actually think about and tackle thorny, uncomfortable problems. And so I love being a part of this, and I feel quite grateful to be here with you. So with that, I'm gonna step back a little bit to Lieutenant Colonel Burns. And I want to dig in a little bit more to some of the comments you made on diversity. You mentioned a systems framework, and you describe a lot about the input. And I would say, as a scientist, we're the systems engineers in my world, we do love a good systems framework. And I think it's pretty common parlance in the military, but I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about kind of what comes after that input, and then perhaps what aspects of that you actually focused on and why.
Right. Great question. So the way I looked at the problem is from a systems framework. And if you think about, let me move back so you can see my hands, but you have an input coming in to a box, and then it's producing an output. So that input in my particular research was minority officers, African-American officers. So that number fluctuates, but essentially you graduate college, you get commissioned into an officer, and you come into the Army system, into the box. And when you look at the socio-technical system, that box has 5 pieces. It's kind of split in a quad with one overlapping box in the middle. So you have your culture, you have your climate, your core competencies, your structure, and then the leadership. And all of those things kind of transform that input into an output. And right now, the output that we have is an undesirable number, underrepresentation of African-American senior leaders. And when I say senior leaders, I mean our colonels and our generals. So essentially, I just wanted to look at the system and see where we could make changes, easy changes, simple changes, cheap changes, because everything has a bill payer, to maybe have an effect on that output. And I looked specifically, just because of the limitations on the research, I tried to narrow it down, and I looked at the climate, I looked at the culture, the structure, and the leadership. So kind of what can we do in those 3 categories? What changes can we make to remove some of those structural barriers to produce a more desirable outcome?
I love this. I think I do love a framework. So I feel like I can wrap my head around that. You have some recommendations, I think, after the research. We'd love to hear after you looked at those kind of big, and I would say seemingly kind of meta topics that perhaps we read about in the media, but how do you actually translate that down to some things that the Army might actually do?
Yeah, that was a great question again. That was really what I wanted to concentrate on, because the Army moves very slowly. I think the government moves very slowly, the military especially. And there's a lot of resistance to change. So I tried to make it simple. I tried to come up with some things that I think would have a big impact, low threat, big impact. And we'd have to see if, through some research, if the Army made these changes, if that was actually true. But I kind of came up with 5 recommendations. And I'll start with what we call our kingmaker positions. So there's different levels of those positions, but essentially, if you get chosen for one of these positions, you have a bright future ahead of you. One of my recommendations was to make these kingmaker positions kind of branching material. so that it wouldn't matter what your what your background is. If you're qualified, you can take that position. And right now, that's not the case. There are some structural limitations. For example, an infantry brigade executive officer has to be an infantry officer. So if I'm a brigade commander and my best officer for this position is a female African-American engineer, I can't put her in there unless I get special permissions. I also wanted to standardize those kingmaker positions, standardize the selection form. So right now, it's literally a bunch of people, a bunch of typically guys sitting around the room saying, hey, who are we going to put in these XO positions? And there's no structure, there's no standardization process. And sometimes there's no transparency on what we call the slate, the summer slate for our key developmental positions, such as executives, officers, S3s, and then some of our nominative positions. If you're the Secretary of the Army's executive officer or public affairs officer, you're probably going to go somewhere. So that's two of the recommendations. Another one was kind of having a permanent DE&I representative at some of our highest levels. Right now, we don't have that. There's no structure for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have an EO, equal opportunity, and it kind of loosely falls within there, but there's no structure and there's no specific guidelines. So, at a very low cost, about 40 positions across the Army, I think we can train and place DEI representatives at, certain levels in the Army so that they can at least help commanders and help units make sure that they are taking steps that are good for DE&I. A fourth recommendation, and this is probably one of the more controversial ones, was to find a fair way to evaluate people on kind of how they're doing with DEI. Even if it's not something that other people can see, even if it's just for you as a tool to kind of inform yourself. Hey, over a 25-year career, I have never given a female a high mark. I have never given, an African-American a high mark. Is it me, or is it, has every African-American officer that worked for me really been kind of center of the mass? And then the final one is kind of improving transparency. And right now, the culture of the Army is really to hold the diversity statistics and who's getting promoted and how we selected them, kind of hold those a close hold. That's kind of the culture of the Army. But I think if you open that up and you improve the transparency there, I really do think that'll improve the trust. Trust from every soldier wearing this uniform, and trust from our civilian leadership when they look at who's in charge in the Army.
I really love this focus on transparency that you end with, because I do think we see so many aspects of our society right now where we have trust challenges, right, with the institutions that we've become accustomed to having very high trust in historically. And I feel like we have an opportunity in the military to really learn from this and lean into it aggressively, right, to try to mitigate that being a challenge to cohesion inside the military. And so I love that you call it out, because I think it's really important. And I think we know how to do it actually in the military, because we know how to document a process. That's for sure. I guess just to wrap up, there's one last question that I think stands out when you talk about diversity, and that is, how do you know when you got it right? It's something that we don't really know what it looks like. I mean, we can count numbers, but we want the best folks, right? And so perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you think for the military specifically, or for the Army specifically, we could really tackle that problem.
Yeah, Melissa, that's a great question. I think, and it's probably the hardest question. And statistics, I don't think is the right answer. When you look at the female population in the United States, right? It's just because we may be near 50% of females in the population, we're nowhere near that in the Army, in the military. It hovers around 10 to 12%. So that's not necessarily the right answer. We don't want 50. I don't know that 50% of the Army being female is reasonable. So I don't think it's statistics. 10%, 15%, should it match? There's so many different ways you can go with that. There's no right answer. I really do think it comes down to perception and how the civilians, our civilian population, how the military internally look at the problem. And when you don't feel like something's off, when we stop having the first African American and the first female selected for this, or the first Asian American selected for this, I think that's when we can start to get a sense of it. It has to be a priority, but I tell you, I think it is a priority, and I think the Army is moving in the right direction. It's a priority for the Chief of Staff of the Army. He talks often about it. It's a priority for the, our senior enlisted advisor, Sergeant Major Grinston, and the Army just created what they call the Army People Strategy, and it really kind of puts its arm around some of the things that nothing I recommended was earth shattering. It puts its arm around some of those things, and it kind of, I think, is going to make the system a lot better.
I love this. As a scientist, I think people expect me to desire everything to be quantitative, but I will tell you, there is no more human endeavor than war. It doesn't matter how much technology we bring to the fight. It's all about a cohesive human group being able and willing to do tremendously unimaginable things and you guys do that. And so I do think perception matters so much to having that trust and that cohesion. And I think the rest of us can learn something from that. So I love that. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks.
With that, we're gonna go to Lieutenant Colonel Lynn. And I love this. Now we're going to talk about the input, right? So we've talked about a lot about inside the box. And I think we don't talk about that very much, but I think we do have some really interesting challenges coming down the pike that actually are going to change the makeup of that input as well. What I think is so interesting about your talk is we spend so much time in the media hearing about, tech challenges, innovation challenges in the DoD. We need digital natives. We need every soldier to code or run AI machines, or I don't know, fill in the blank to whatever, Wire magazine wants to fill in that blank. And yet, if we do have to fight in the dark, as you say, and I love that, we have to figure out a way to balance really high-tech skills with really low-tech skills. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on strategies that actually balance what seems, I think, like a contradiction if you just look at it on paper.
Absolutely. I mean, contradiction, it's a constrained optimization problem. And, we're the ones who have to figure it out. It's both and. We can't afford to fail at anything. And both the high-end, exquisite capability to iterate the fastest, to be the most lethal, the quickest, have the most deterrence is contingent upon having those high-end capabilities that can execute our military preferences quickly and effectively. But the ability, as combat were to progress, and if the permissive technological environment goes away, if GPS is disabled, if our high-end technology is no longer functioning, to maintain the capability to fight again with the lights out. And so it can't be either or. It's got to be from our human capital selection right up front, all the way through to the way we acquire systems. We've got to make them as robust as possible. The more we can maintain the ability to fight with the lights on with that exquisite technology, the better off we are. But the better we're able to downshift into that, 4-low gear and, do celestial navigations and navigate through the woods, with a map and a compass, with, snakes biting our ankles, the less our adversaries are likely to think it's a good idea to take those things out, because that'll have a big impact on the civilian population and our ability to continue operations as well. So it's both and.
I love that answer. One of the things that I often say to folks when they ask me why I think working on military technology is so exciting, I say it's actually because we trust our people so much. And so the tech is as good as the person operating it. And also what the adversary always knows is that in the United States, we love our tech, but we actually trust our people more. And so if the tech breaks, we believe and we have trained people to be agile and to actually have a backup plan. And so I think it's really important to hear that this continues. and to actually talk about the fact that we value both the human component and the technological component, which I don't think shows up in the media as often as innovation strategies does, for sure. So it is fascinating, though, because you talk about this input that's the technology use by kids, and we clearly can't legislate on the civilian side from the military, but we can control how within the military, I'm sorry, I keep saying we, I clearly don't work for the military anymore, but boy, it's hard to get rid of it once they give you the Kool-Aid.
We're on the team.
But we can control how we select and train recruits. So this is a sort of a new challenge. What strategies do you have for us to consider that might be useful as we think about this?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's a bunch of versions of us, as we look at, what experience do we want, our people to have. There's individuals that can, look at this research and see, okay, I want to intentionally deprive myself of, Google Maps with the center of the universe button so that I can develop. I want to go take some land navigation training. There's businesses, nobody's great grandparents went to a gym because their lifestyles didn't necessitate it. And, enter Gold's Gym and CrossFit and Orange, pick your poison, right? Peloton, it's become that those businesses didn't exist, 3 generations ago because the lifestyles didn't require it. But the technology and the marginal productivity of labor, physical labor, has improved so much we don't have to do those things. And so the business opportunities are there. Our community norms around things like obesity have changed. What's healthy, what's permissible, what can you feed your kids without getting sideways looks, at the mall. And then from a government perspective, we don't want to draconian, no cell phones before you're 18 policy. But there's ways to encourage behavior that we think is useful for human development. Again, kind of like we did with obesity, with the food plate, with the CDC's recommendations for how we should eat. So I think you have to look at who the we we're talking about specifically is, and we have to collectively decide, what's the right way for each of those groups.
I think that's great. Recently, my 13-year-old niece was dropped off in a state park without their phones to do an orienteering course. It was not pretty, but she learned what a compass does. And so I do think there are interesting aspects to this that perhaps we can actually make exciting in a whole different way as we make this transition. So thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Lynn.
Not pretty sounds uncomfortable. It sounds like learning.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to make a soldier out of her, but we'll see. She learned something. All right. With that, we are going to turn to Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, and you're really talking about the entire framework, right? It's who we bring in, it's what we do with people inside the box, and it's actually like even on the far side of another side of the output, right? After they retire, how we sustain a healthy relationship with them on the flip side of that. So I think that one thing that maybe many folks have heard about is when Secretary Austin came in last year, he actually had a stand down across the entire military and services to look at this issue of extremism. I would love to hear your thoughts on kind of why that matters.
It's an amazing thing to think about, really, in one sense, where the Secretary Austin said, everybody in the military, all civilians, everyone stop for today because we need to talk about this issue. I think that is a great signaling by the Secretary of Defense to let everyone know that this is an issue that is important, and we need to do new things to tackle it, to reduce it, to identify extremists if they are there, to eliminate those that need to be eliminated, but also hopefully to change the extremist views of those and reduce extremist ideology in the military. So
I think that's great. I also think, right, so you send the signal, but then it's up to all the other folks left in the room after the stand down to figure out, so what does that mean, right? And so you've kind of mentioned, and I think we learned this actually outside of the United States over the last 20 years, dealing with a lot of extremism in other places, that, as you mentioned, that punishment is perhaps necessary, but doesn't necessarily solve your extremism problem. And so after years of research into extremism, are there things that some folks like psychologists can actually tell us that suggest positive options for dealing with the problem?
Absolutely. So it would have been awesome, wonderful if one day stand down could have solved the problem, right? But the military comes from the civilian population. And so if there are any issues in the civilian population, we'll see some of that in the military. But in the military, we expect that we can overcome things and produce a better product. And so one of the things that the military is learning about extremism, especially from studies from psychologists, is you can identify people before they come into the military. Relatively straightforward. And there are ways to individually tackle folks with extremist ideologies and reduce them and maybe hopefully eliminate extremism. So there are taken steps. We're moving forward. There has been a working group with the Secretary of Defense that's been working since almost January 6th. Immediately after, they've changed regulations. They've changed what the definition of extremism is, and they are now in the process of figuring out what to do next by identifying extremists within our ranks, and also hopefully stopping those who have extremist views from joining.
The scientist in me is grateful that somebody used some research.
The prosecutor in me is struggles with it, because I did go to Berkeley, California. That's where I graduated from law school. But I dealt with extremism when I was a local prosecutor in Seattle, which was left-wing anti-trade extremist activities. When I was a federal prosecutor in Las Vegas, I dealt with religious extremism and also anti-government, sovereign citizen type extremism. And in the military, now we have this kind of, however you want to label, right-wing extremism, and they're all similar in what draws people to them. And when they engage in extremist activities, those are almost always criminal activities that can be punished. And so it is in my nature, both as a soldier and a prosecutor, to want to punish it, and as we should. But the way punishing extremism doesn't reduce extremism. What it may end up doing is eliminating the extremist soldier and producing an even more extremist veteran. And so we have to do other things in addition to punishment.
I love this. I have another question for you, but I think that your description about your background and the way that you have experienced and viewed extremism across such a wide spectrum actually makes me want to go to one of the Q&A that we have that is looking at a very specific version of it, but I think that you might be able to answer this more holistically, which I think is interesting. So we have a question that says, what are your thoughts about the potential influence of having Fox News playing at many locations on military bases? Its content exposes personnel, especially young ones and their families with young children, to views that are not supportive of inclusion and diversity, and may also espouse negative or untrue views of government policies and leaders. I am an Army veteran. So maybe you have thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Awesome. Coming from an Army veteran. I think what may surprise people who don't have connections to the military is that the military has a very different, diverse group of individuals that come from all spectrums. We come from every part of the country. Our socioeconomic backgrounds are different. We maybe need to do better in some areas, as Colonel Burns was talking about. But if you're a soldier or in the military, you come around an organized idea that what you have to believe in is a common mission and a common set of values about what we need to do. But your personal viewpoints, your political viewpoints are all respected, and you have to learn to work with those who have different views. And so whether you watch Fox News or MSNBC, you have to be able to work with someone who watches the other channel. And so that creates an opportunity, I think, for the military. We can have difficult, hard conversations that maybe are more difficult to have in the civilian population. And so I think some of those things give us hope going forward that we can tackle some of this extremism by individual dialogue, by engaging those, because we are forced, working with people from different backgrounds of us may make us, are some of the best ways to reduce or confront and dispel some of these extremist ideologies.
I love this. It takes me to a moment when I was sitting in the Pentagon, and there was CNN on one, I was in a cafeteria and there was CNN on one TV and Fox on the other, and they're blaring. And there are a whole bunch of us in the middle, just like, shut them all up. And it was like a moment where I was with a colleague of mine who has very, very, very different political views than me. And we were just united in our desire for a quiet Panda Express bowl, and we just couldn't get one. So I do think we could just mute the TVs. I mean, we can have them going, but maybe we could just mute them occasionally. But in all seriousness, I think it is really critical to remember that you're more likely to change somebody's mind if they know you and they know you care about them and they know you have some common set of values in that Venn diagram overlap, as opposed to just being yelled at by someone you feel like doesn't respect you. And I think it's critical.
That doesn't work. In fact, that the positive and the difficulty of some of the studies here is that the best way to dispel extremism is from a trusted individual who just through dialogue helps an individual confront the discrepancy between this ideology they have and the reality before them. And so that one-on-one interaction with someone who you respect can work, and definitely, absolutely can work to stop from extremist actions, criminal actions, and reduce it, and sometimes can completely change. And the military has the opportunity, because we have that forced interaction. We develop early on a trust in the people you serve with. And so there is, which is what we need to do, because we're one of the most trusted organizations in America. We have to be better at dealing with this than everyone else is, and that we will, I believe, do that.
And Melissa, I just wanted to jump in there. A great conversation here. I'm an educator at the Army War College, and we encourage our students to get diverse news sources. And it's not just, it's helpful to extremism, but it's also helpful to be a more effective operator in the world, because it encourages you to view the world through someone else's eyes. And a term that we sometimes use is strategic empathy, right? How does another country view what we are doing, and how might they react to what we are doing? And having that understanding is beneficial across so many endeavors of what we do. And that's what we try to encourage when our students come to our program.
I love that. Strategic empathy. I'm gonna steal that one of these days. We've had Lieutenant Colonel Burns, we've had a great response to your comments in the Q&A. Most of them were, well, we had a couple of comments on it, but we do have a question. Perception of the military is vital. My daughter's high scores and grades in science and technology in Northern Virginia garnered invitations. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat to attend the service academies. I asked why, and she heard stories of sexual aggression, and is every order an order and one that is morally offensive to her. So I guess she's saying like that she would have to take an order and execute on it, even if it were morally offensive to her. How is this changing? In my opinion, the country lost a talented chemical engineer because of perception. I'm a civilian and not from a professional military family and could not answer her concern. She also comments that she did not want to even explore attendance because of that perception.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I'm sorry she heard that. And if there's any possibility for her to you to influence her to at least look into it more, I think she'd get something out of it. The service academies, they have had issues. My son attends one of the service academies, so I know firsthand. But they've done a really good job at trying to be transparent they've tried to kind of reduce some of these instances of corrosive behaviors. They're trying to identify it. They're trying to stop it. And they value everybody. I know each one of the service academies has a really, really strong diversity recruiting department, and they want to show what it's like. So if you reach out to them, they will talk about it. They will help. And the students are actually, it's an incredibly how they actually run the school. So everything that happens in those barracks, it's all students. So as the new generations come in, those students are going to run that. So I think as our children change and you get away from the old people who are running things, they're going to run it the way they want it to be run. But it's zero, I would tell you there's zero tolerance for sexual assault, sexual harassment in the service academies. It's something that they always take serious. And we definitely need great chemical engineers and high-speed soldiers to join the military. So I would encourage her to look at it more. And I'm happy to share my email address. I can connect her with one of them if she'd like to, however.
I think that's great. We have a question for Lieutenant Colonel Lynn, but before I go there, there's a comment in the chat that says, perhaps Lieutenant Colonel Burns, that you might want to comment on the role of diversity in reducing extremism in the ranks. Now, we didn't invite you here to talk about extremism, so I'm not going to make you, but if you have thoughts on the role of diversity in general, as it relates to that, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so DE&I is something that's kind of very near and dear to my heart. I've got more years behind me than I do in front of me. So again, I've got kids in the Army, nephews in the Army, so it's kind of personal for me. When we came to the War College, everybody had to sign up for a job. Hey, you're the sports guy, or you're the calendar guy. I just wanted to be the DEI guy. And we're working on some training to kind of train our leaders. And I think like I think it was Sam that spoke about it, the more you reach out and touch people and get outside of your circle, and the Army kind of forces that. Everybody that's deployed to Europe right now, they're in a tent together, whether they like each other or not. They're sleeping next to each other, they're talking to each other, they're eating together, they're suffering, they're miserable together for a little while. So the Army kind of forces that. And I think the more people are open to dialogue, the more this is put on the forefront and made an issue, and people talk about it, and we have hard discussions and hard conversations. I think it reduces, again, those instances of corrosive behavior.
I think that's great. Thank you. All right, so Lieutenant Colonel Lynn, we have a question that says, is the military aware of the impacts of video games on the next generation's interest and ability to serve in the military, i.e. Fortnite and Call of Duty? Does the military engage with the gaming industry?
Absolutely, right. The military, especially the recruiters, that's where young people are hanging out. So no, I mean, if you look at some of those video games, you see advertising campaigns as recruiting to the Army's tried to build video games before. It turns out our objective function is not as much fun, and so we kind of leave the development of games to the experts, Epic and all the rest. But we absolutely engage with it as a community. Actually, as a battalion commander, I sent a soldier to an esports competition as a soldier on behalf of the military to compete in gaming. The military in general uses gaming. Well, we can take the fun out of almost anything, games included. So we call them, simulations or virtual or constructive training. And so, some of the things we're trying to do is train hard skills like land navigation using virtual tools, so you can increase the depth and decrease the risk. So immersive, virtual, VR type experiences to train physical capabilities without injuring anybody or spending too much on ammunition or get fuel is a way that the military absolutely uses games. So we engage with the industry for kind of recruiting and publicity purposes, and then use them as tools for developing and training ourselves.
I can vouch for the fact that I almost got sick in a flight simulator, and I would not have made a good aviator. So they were dragging the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense out before I soiled the very expensive simulator at the lab. but I do think the military actually has a fascinating relationship with the gaming industry, and some of the simulators in the military that actually bring sensory experience in, smells, sound, like actual physical aspects to the simulation as well as a virtual environment are pretty impressive. And I think that's probably not something that people outside of the military see very often, and maybe even outside of some of the labs and some of the specific groups that actually use them. We have another question that is going to be for any of you. So if you want to chime in, wag a finger. What do the panelists think of the proposal to bring people into the officer corps at higher ranks after they have worked in the civilian world for several years, rather than have everyone come in at the bottom? I will tell you, I have an opinion on this, but they don't want to hear mine. Sorry, Lieutenant Colonel Lynn and then Lieutenant Colonel Burns, sorry.
It's something that the military is looked into, especially amongst the specialties, things like lawyers, doctors, and there are non-rank, GS employees, government service employees, where there's an equivalent, but it doesn't come with the military authority that a military rank confers, constitutionally. So we're now looking at it in places like cyber, where you kind of need both of those things. You need the authority. You're going to have, direct supervisory control or potentially command over subordinate officers and enlisted soldiers. So the military constantly considers it, but there is cultural resistance to somebody kind of laddering in laterally and assuming a rank that others may have perceived they didn't necessarily earn. So I think it's a struggle, and I think places like cyber are where we are as forward leaning as we've been in a long time.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. I want to go to Lieutenant Colonel Burns, and then we'll come to you, Lieutenant Colonel Walsh.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with a lot of the things that he said. Cyber is going to give us the biggest challenge in this. There are some general kind of rank privileges that you get when you come in as a colonel, for example, right? So, if you're a civilian one day and a colonel the next day, there's probably some things that you're not going to understand or have the context for. But when you look at some of those specialties, we think, 15 years back during the surge, perfectly okay with the 65-year-old surgeon. Hey, I want to serve. I want to go do something. Join the military. Join the National Guard for a very short period of time. Go serve forward. Save soldiers' lives where it's important, where it's critical. Dentists. Some of those specialties that civilian. There's lots of civilian expertise. I think that's a good fit. But there are some struggles and some pushbacks and resistance, and there's some I would say some consequences to it as well.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Walsh.
I am a lawyer, and so we come in a little bit senior to others as first lieutenants, and I joined actually at 32 years old after I'd been a lawyer for 7 years, and I was an assistant. I was a federal prosecutor, but there is value in moving up the ranks. I think our balance is pretty nice because we have, the Department of Defense and the services have civilian counterparts where they can put in junior people who are extremely capable in those positions and assume leadership roles. But in the military, there are some pockets where you can put a senior person who hasn't grown up, but the vast majority of officers are leaders, and the Army and the services develop that leadership. It takes time, it takes effort, and finding that outside of the military world is hard. So I can be a leader of lawyers, but bringing in someone senior to lead an infantry brigade will never work, no matter how amazing or capable they are, because of what they've learned in there. So I came in bristling a little bit about not being able to do it, and I have since drank the Kool-Aid, to use your phrase, that the system that the military used to grow. So maybe there will be pockets in cyber and other places, but the system really works rather well to create really capable leaders.
I got to say, having been a civilian that has supported the military for 20 years, there are a lot of people like me, right? And when we are respectful and engaged, and military officers understand the value we bring to the table, those relationships are effective. I will tell you, when I first started working for the Navy, they sent me out on an amphib. I was a GS-14, but I was 30. And they introduced me as a commander, like a commander rank, right? Like they gave an equivalent rank. And these kids are throwing themselves up against walls every time I walk down the hall. And I'm like, what is happening? And after 4 days on a ship where I did not have a job, and every single other person on that ship was training to be deployed to the Gulf in 2004 and risk their life, I left knowing that there's a difference in what I do and what they do. And it doesn't mean that what I do doesn't have value, but it is differently valuable. And I do not have the same type of relationship with a military officer, nor should I. And I've never felt that that diminished my role. And I've never felt that that made me superior or inferior to my active duty colleagues. But I think we have to train people, right? So I actually have huge concerns when I hear about these recommendations. And my assumption is that they often come from civilians and not from the military. But that's a personal little opinion. I think we have time for one more, although we have two questions. So we'll see what you can do in 3 minutes before I wrap. Well, 2 minutes. We have one that says, how is, okay, I'm going to change. I'm going to go to the last one that came in because I think we can do it in 2 minutes. And I want anybody who wants to answer it, let me know. Do you think that civil military relations have improved or degraded since the beginning of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars?
I'll start. I'll start. I think when we look at what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, the best term I can use is ebb and flow. I think it was I think after 9/11 there was a great point where everyone came together, everyone was on the same page. But the enemy gets a vote and things didn't necessarily go like we thought they would go in Afghanistan and Iraq, and kind of follow on places, even here in the States. So I think it's kind of ebbed and flowed. It's been really great at certain points in certain administrations with certain people. And then it's also kind of degraded a little bit. So I would say that.
That's great. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, you had a comment?
Yeah, I think Colonel Burns's answer was fantastic, but I think one of the side effects is that civilians have learned a lot more about the military, and coming in as a reservist, that there are a lot of folks who only have contacts with reservists that aren't connected to large military bases or pockets where the military is well known. And the more that our society gets to know how the military works, who in there, and who gets to know whether they like it or not, that is better. And so some of the knowledge has led to some of the ebbs, as Colonel Byrne talked about, but there were also improvements into the military because of that. And so I think the key issue is finding a way where the civil military relationship is robust and dialogue is robust, and kind of fight to avoid the military becoming too much insular and the civilian population not really having a personal connection with those who serve.
I love that.
If I can give it a shot just in 30 seconds or less, I mean, if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan versus something for instance, Vietnam, I mean, the US population's ability to separate the war from the warrior, it's a lesson it seems like the nation has absolutely learned. And as we've drawn down both from Iraq and Afghanistan, I think that maintains. I mean, Mike talked about the ebb and the flow. Obviously, it's going to be higher, on 9/12/2001 than it is, 20 years forth. But I don't feel any kind of ebb in the support that myself, my soldiers have from the U.S. population. I think the deeper we get into this all volunteer force, the farther people get from the military. And I think that's the importance of doing things. That's what this was founded for, like Colonel Bukowski talked about at the front end after Vietnam. And that's as essential as we continue closing bases and people and families get farther and farther away post-draft era, that maintaining close contact, putting a human face on top of the uniform is more and more essential. So thanks for the opportunity here to help stem any future ebbs to that relationship.
That's wonderful. This has been an incredible panel. I need to take us home. We're right on the nose at the end, and I've got just a few comments that I need to make. But first of all, I want to say again, with gratitude, how enjoyable and really exciting and I think inspiring the conversation has been. And I hope that you all got something out of this conversation as well. I do think these are the types of conversations we need to be having with a broader population. And thanks so much for the audience for joining us. I know that we made some last minute adjustments, but I do feel like going remote gives us an incredible opportunity to have more reach than we would always have. And a huge shout out to Perry Worldhouse, because I think they host such an incredible range of topics that are of value to both US citizens and also folks across the world thinking about national security. So we hope to see you again on Tuesday, March 1st at 4 p.m. for the next edition of The World Today on Global Justice, the struggle for women's human rights, featuring Rangita de Silva de Alves is the Associate Dean of International Affairs at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and LaShawn R. Jefferson, Perry Worldhouse's Executive Director. This event will be in person at Perry Worldhouse and live streamed on Zoom. Given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Perry Worldhouse will be convening an expert briefing featuring Philadelphia Inquirer columnist Trudy Rubin, who has just returned from a trip to Ukraine, Perry Worldhouse lightning scholar and Temple University assistant professor Jane Weinman, and University of Pennsylvania professor Rudra Sil and former US ambassador to Russia, Alexander Vershbaum, on Wednesday, March 2nd at 4 p.m. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on the Perry Worldhouse YouTube channel, and you can find out about all the great events we have planned for the next semester by joining the mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll drop links to all of those in the chat as well. For those joining us in person, well, there weren't any of you today. Sorry about that. And thank you all for being here.